By the time I stepped through the wide oak doors of the Whitman estate, 6 months had passed since my father's funeral. The house looked the same as it always had, the chandeliers glowing a pale gold above polished marble floors, the long tables draped in linen, the air heavy with perfume, and the scent of roast lamb drifting from the kitchen. But nothing felt the same. My father's absence was louder than any string quartet playing in the corner. Tonight was meant to be a memorial gathering, a chance for family to honor his memory. Instead, it felt like a stage set for a performance in which I already knew my role would be diminished. I moved carefully through the crowd, my heels clicking softly. Conversations lowered to whispers when I passed. I caught fragments liability week does not belong. I had heard these words for years. My mother had trained people to repeat them. Martha Whitman stood near the fireplace, her pearls catching the light, her smile fixed like a mask. Next to her was Ethan, my older brother. He towered over the relatives around him, laughing too loudly, gesturing like a man already crowned king. For a moment, I thought about leaving before anyone noticed me, but then his voice cut through the air. "Clara is here." The way he said my name carried no warmth. Faces turned. I straightened my shoulders, forcing calm into my steps. I reminded myself of what my Aunt Lydia once told me. Dignity is not negotiable. I reached the center of the room just as Ethan raised his glass. "To the one true heir of this family," he declared. The room erupted in applause, but I saw how many people clapped slowly, uneasily. My mother smiled beside him, proud, her hand resting on his arm like he was the sole pillar holding her world. I stopped a few feet away, my breath steady though my heart hammered against my ribs. My father would never have wanted this. He had been strict, distant at times, but he was not unfair. He believed in balance. Even as cancer took him, he spoke to me about independence, about building my own foundation. He never once suggested that Ethan should take everything. Yet here they were, rewriting his wishes with a straight face. Ethan's eyes locked on mine. "You should have stayed in your small apartment, Clara. No one wants you here." I swallowed the anger rising in my throat. This was not new. I had been excluded at every family dinner, every holiday slideshow where my photos were cropped out. But tonight was worse because it was wrapped in the pretense of honoring the man who had loved me in his quiet way. I turned slightly ready to step back into the corner when it happened. Ethan moved forward with a speed I had not expected. His hand shoved against my shoulder first, sending me stumbling. Gasps rose around us. Then before I could catch myself, his foot drove into my side with a force that stole my breath. Pain shot through my chest. I heard it before I felt it fully, the sharp crack of a rib giving way under his kick. The sound echoed in my head louder than the cries of the crowd. My knees buckled and I collapsed to the floor, my hands scrambling against the marble. My vision blurred as heat spread across my chest and down my arm. The guests froze in shock. A cousin covered her mouth. Another raised a phone instinctively. My mother did not move to stop him. Instead, she stood tall behind Ethan, her lips curved in disdain. "You were always too weak to deserve it," she said, her voice calm enough to cut through the chaos. I lay there gasping, every breath stabbing me like a knife. Ethan loomed above me, his face red sweat shining on his forehead. "The inheritance is mine," he roared. His words ricocheted off the vaulted ceiling. The chandelier trembled from the vibration. No one moved to help me. They had been trained to look the other way. For years, Martha had taught them that Ethan was untouchable, that I was disposable. And in that moment, as I tasted iron in my mouth, I wondered if they all believed it. But then I saw Aunt Lydia. She was across the room, standing near the French doors that opened onto the terrace. Her face was pale, her eyes sharp, her hands clenched at her sides. She did not rush forward, but her gaze held mine with a quiet steadiness. It was the kind of look that said, "Hold on, not yet, this is not the end." Two guests finally broke the silence, kneeling beside me, whispering if I could stand. I shook my head, unable to form words. Every attempt to breathe sent fire across my chest. Ethan stood back, his chest heaving as if satisfied with the demonstration. My mother placed her hand on his arm again, whispering something too low to hear. Voices rose. Someone shouted to call an ambulance. Another argued it was just fainting, just dramatics. I could see the divide forming, some siding with Martha's composed narrative, others shaken by what they had just witnessed. I pressed my palm against my ribs, feeling the swelling beneath my skin, the raw tenderness that confirmed what I already knew. Something inside me had broken, and in that pain, through the humiliation and the betrayal, a cold clarity settled. They wanted me erased, silenced, cut out of the story of this family, just as my photo had been cropped from albums. But I was not going to vanish. Not this time. When the paramedics arrived, the room split apart like the C relatives moving aside reluctantly. The bright uniforms and the smell of antiseptic replaced the perfume and champagne. Hands lifted me onto a stretcher. The ceiling lights blurred as they rolled me out Ethan's words, still ringing in my ears. "The inheritance is mine." As the doors closed behind me, I caught one last image, my mother perfectly composed, watching me with eyes that carried no love, only calculation. In the sharp pain of that night, I realized something vital. Pain could crush me, but it could also sharpen me. They had cracked my ribs, but they had also revealed the truth of what I was up against. And somewhere deep inside, a resolve began to form. I would not be erased. I would remember everything. And when the time came, I would not fight with rage alone. I would fight with proof. When people ask me what my childhood was like, I never know how to answer in one sentence. Because to outsiders, the Whitman family looked perfect. We had the big colonial house with white columns out front, the manicured lawn, the luxury cars lined up in the driveway, and the constant parade of neighbors who envied how polished everything seemed. But behind closed doors, perfection meant silence comparisons and a constant reminder that I was never enough. Ethan was born first, and from the moment he arrived, my mother Martha declared him her shining star. He had her smile, her bold laugh, and she wrapped her pride around him like armor. When he misbehaved, she laughed it off as boys will be boys. When I misbehaved, which usually meant I cried too loudly or asked too many questions, I was told I was dramatic, weak, and a liability. The word liability became a nickname in our house, whispered by Ethan when no one was watching, murmured by Martha at the dinner table when I dropped a fork or spilled milk. My father Douglas was strict but not cruel. He was not affectionate either, but I always felt he saw more than he said. He did not intervene much when Ethan pushed me or when Martha scolded me. But there were moments when his eyes would soften, as if he recognized the imbalance. He was a man of rules, and rules gave him distance. For me, that distance was still better than the sharp edge of my mother's tongue. Ethan thrived under their gaze. He was captain of the football team in high school, always invited to the best parties, always arriving home long past curfew. When teachers called to report his behavior, Martha smoothed it over with charm, and Douglas quietly signed checks to keep coaches and schools satisfied. I, on the other hand, was the quiet student with perfect attendance and straight A's. I won science fairs, earned scholarships, but my accomplishments were footnotes. At dinner, when relatives asked about us, the conversation always circled back to Ethan. He was the heir, the pride, the golden child. I was the reminder that families sometimes produce weak links. I remember one Thanksgiving in particular. I had just won an award for an essay on environmental design, the kind of recognition that came with a small scholarship. I was excited, hopeful that maybe this time they would see me. I brought the certificate home, showed it to my mother as she basted the turkey. She looked at it for 3 seconds before setting it on the counter without a word. Minutes later, Ethan stormed in bragging about how he had scored 2 touchdowns the night before, and Martha clapped her hands like he had won the Nobel Prize. My certificate disappeared under stacks of mail, never mentioned again. Growing up like that taught me to seek validation outside. Teachers, mentors, neighbors, even strangers saw qualities in me that my family refused to acknowledge. Aunt Lydia was the rare relative who never compared us. She noticed when I stayed late at the library, when I fixed the leaky sink myself, when I took summer jobs while Ethan lounged at the pool. She once whispered to me, "Clara, you have strength your mother refuses to see. Remember, strength isn't always loud." Those words became a lifeline. Ethan never had to work for anything. New cars appeared on his birthdays, tuition checks were covered without question, internships were handed to him through my mother's friends. I applied for scholarships, filled out endless forms, and balanced part-time jobs just to prove I could stand on my own. Douglas paid, but not blindly. He respected evidence of effort, so he helped with what scholarships did not cover. It was not affection, but it was fairness in his own way. That fairness died with him. After cancer took him, the fragile balance collapsed. Martha finally had no counterweight, no quiet judge standing in the corner. Ethan became not just the golden child, but the only child she acknowledged. For me, the house became unbearable. During those 6 months after the funeral, I visited rarely, each time enduring whispers and side glances. Relatives who once smiled at me now treated me as though my presence was a burden. Martha made comments like, "Why don't you just stay in your apartment? Clara, these gatherings are for family." Ethan laughed when she said it, his eyes daring me to protest. I kept quiet, but inside, something hardened. The bias had turned from subtle into absolute. They no longer bothered to hide it. I was not just overlooked. I was deliberately erased. My father's study still smelled faintly of tobacco and leather, the place he had kept his ledgers, his books, his files. When I sneaked in once after the funeral, I looked for some trace of protection. The desk drawers were empty, the safe cleaned out. Martha had made sure there was no trail, no record that could anchor me. I remember standing in that room, running my hand over the oak desk where he once sat, realizing the last thread of balance was gone. Ethan caught me there and sneered. "What are you looking for, Clara? A note saying he loved you more." He laughed, the sound cold and cruel. I walked out, refusing to give him the satisfaction of tears. From then on, every visit felt like entering enemy territory. I was invited out of obligation, then ignored, insulted, or belittled. The word liability returned in Martha's whispers, in Ethan's mocking laughter, in the eyes of relatives who chose to side with power. Yet even in that pain, I carried Lydia's voice in my memory, reminding me that strength does not always roar. Sometimes strength endures, gathers weights. And though I felt completely abandoned after Douglas was gone, I also knew that endurance was building something inside me, something I would need when the day came to stand up to both of them. That day arrived faster than I expected. The morning after the funeral still haunts me because it was the first time I realized my mother and Ethan had moved from subtle cruelty into open betrayal. We gathered in the dining room, the one with tall windows that overlooked the garden my father used to tend. The room was hushed except for the scrape of chairs and the sound of Martha's bracelets clinking as she adjusted her papers. Everyone expected a reading of the will, a moment of closure, but instead, my mother produced a neatly folded document from her handbag and placed it on the table as though it were sacred scripture. "This," she announced, "is your father's final will." Ethan sat beside her, his chin raised, his eyes scanning the room like he had already won. I remember the pit in my stomach as she began to read. The estate, valued at $2.3 million, would be left entirely to her beloved son, Ethan. My name was not mentioned once. Gasps rippled around the table, though quickly silenced by her icy glare. I stared at the paper at the signature that looked like my father's, but carried something off in the slant, and for a moment I could not breathe. My father had been strict, but not unjust, and deep down I knew he would never have erased me completely. He had spoken to me privately about fairness, about making sure both his children had stability. Yet here I was being declared invisible with one piece of paper. Ethan leaned back in his chair, smug. "Looks like Dad knew who the real heir was," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Relatives shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced at me with pity, others with indifference, as if siding with power was easier than questioning it. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but my throat tightened. Years of conditioning had taught me that protesting only gave them more fuel. So I sat in silence, my fists clenched under the table. Martha folded the document again, her smile thin. "This is final. Let us not drag it into drama. It is what your father wanted." The lie tasted bitter, even though she spoke it calmly. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Aunt Lydia. She was seated further down, quiet, her hands folded in her lap. She did not protest, did not contradict, but her gaze lingered on me longer than anyone else's. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of knowledge that gave me pause. She had been close to my father, closer than most, and I remembered how often he trusted her with details Martha dismissed. In that moment, though, she said nothing. I felt a thread of reassurance, faint but real. Ethan stood and raised a glass to my father, to my mother, and to me, the rightful heir. The room joined in half-heartedly, but the sound felt hollow, forced. I kept my eyes on the table, the wood grain blurring as tears threatened. I bit the inside of my cheek until the taste of iron reminded me to hold them back. They wanted me broken, humiliated, erased. I could not give them that victory. After the gathering ended, I lingered in the hall, listening to voices fade as relatives departed. I overheard two cousins whispering near the door. Strange one said Douglas always spoke about fairness. He loved Clara in his way. The other hushed him quickly, glancing toward Martha, who was thanking guests with her polished hostess smile. Their doubt was brief, easily swallowed by her charm. I walked outside into the garden, the chill air stinging my face. The roses my father had planted were beginning to wither, neglected in his absence. I touched one of the brittle petals and thought of how quickly things fade when care is gone. My chest tightened with grief, but beneath it was suspicion. That signature had not been his. Or, if it was, it had been coerced, taken when he was too weak to argue. The certainty grew inside me heavy and sharp. Back inside, Ethan cornered me in the hallway. He leaned close, his breath hot with arrogance. "You are out, Clara. You were always out. Now it is written." He tapped his chest with his fist. "All of this is mine." I said nothing. He expected a reaction, a burst of anger. Instead, I met his stare until he looked away, uncomfortable for a flicker of a second. That was when I realized silence could be its own weapon. Later that night, I sat in my small apartment, the city lights blinking through the window. I replayed every word of the reading, every smirk on Ethan's face, every calculated pause from Martha. The betrayal was complete, but my instincts told me the truth was not gone. Somewhere there was another document, another record. My father had been meticulous, not careless. He would not have left me nothing. The problem was that Martha controlled the house, the files, the narrative. She had erased me before in photos and conversations and family dinners where my achievements vanished into air. Now she was erasing me legally, publicly. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window and whispered to myself, dignity is not negotiable. It had become my anchor. My way of remembering that even when they stripped everything, I still had my resolve. In the weeks that followed, relatives began treating Ethan like the new patriarch. He strutted through gatherings, Martha at his side, both of them basking in the illusion of legitimacy. I kept my distance, watching recording details, storing them away like ammunition. I did not know how or when, but I knew one day their performance would collapse under the weight of its own lies. For now, I let them believe they had won. The evening of the family dinner remains burned into my memory because it was the night the humiliation became public theater. The long oak table stretched across the dining room, candles flickering in silver holders, plates gleaming under the soft glow of chandeliers. I had almost convinced myself that perhaps this time it would be different, that with my father gone, they might at least try to maintain dignity, but the moment I entered, I felt the shift. Ethan was already seated at the head of the table, my father's place leaning back with his arm draped casually over the chair like a king receiving subjects. Martha sat to his right, pearls around her throat, her smile thin and sharp. The seats filled quickly, relatives murmuring greetings, avoiding my eyes as though looking at me too long might cost them favor. When I reached for a chair near the center, Martha's voice cut through the chatter. "Not there, Clara. Sit at the end." Her tone was sweet enough to deceive outsiders, but I knew the command beneath it. Heat flushed my cheeks as heads turned. I walked the length of the table and slid into a seat near the swinging kitchen doors, the smell of garlic butter and sizzling pans wafting over me each time they opened. It was deliberate, a message written in the seating chart, "You do not belong here." I forced myself to straighten to meet eyes when people glanced my way, but the shame pricked like needles under my skin. Dinner began with clinking cutlery, polite conversation about business deals, charity galas, Ethan's latest ventures. He spoke loudly, filling the room with stories that painted him as accomplished, though most were half-truths. Relatives nodded along, eager to stay in his good graces. I listened quietly, pushing vegetables around my plate, trying to steady my breathing. Then Martha's voice rose above the hum. "You have leeched long enough, Clara." The words dropped like stones into silence. Forks paused mid-air. A cousin gasped softly. I froze, my pulse hammering. She smiled as if she had made a harmless joke, but her eyes were sharp, daring me to protest. Ethan raised his glass, grinning. To me, the true heir, he declared, his voice booming. Glasses clinked down the table, though not everyone joined in. Some sipped hesitantly, eyes darting to me with unease. My chest tightened, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. Dignity is not negotiable, I reminded myself. Every cell in my body screamed to shout, to throw the truth across the table, but I bit down hard on my tongue. From where I sat, I could see the reflection of the chandelier in my water glass warped and trembling, much like the image of my family. The humiliation was complete, orchestrated with precision. Ethan basked in attention, recounting how he planned to expand our father's estate, how he would invest, how he would honor the Whitman name. I noticed how Martha's hand brushed his arm proudly, how her smile widened each time he boasted. They were partners in this performance, rewriting history in real time. My throat ached with swallowed words, but I forced myself to watch, to memorize every detail. Across the table, a younger cousin lifted her phone subtly, the camera angled just enough to capture Ethan's toast. Another relative quickly nudged her, whispering for her to put it away, but not before a few seconds were recorded. That flicker of defiance, however small, sparked something inside me. They might control the stage, but not every audience member believed the script. As dessert was served, Ethan leaned back in his chair, smirking at me across the distance. "You really should be grateful, Clara. At least we let you eat at the table." Laughter erupted from a few of his friends seated nearby, the cruel kind that echoes in memory. My hands trembled in my lap, my nails digging into my palms. I wanted to throw the plate across the room, to let rage consume me, but I knew that would only serve their story, the narrative of Clara the unstable, the liability. Instead, I lifted my chin, met his eyes, and let silence stretch until the laughter faltered. That was my victory, small but real. By the end of the evening, I felt drained, every nerve raw, but beneath the exhaustion was resolve. Each humiliation was no longer just pain, it was evidence. Each public slight was a thread in a tapestry I would one day unravel before them all. As I stood to leave, Martha's voice followed me like a shadow. "Remember, Clara family loyalty is everything. Betray it, and you will regret it." She said it sweetly, her lips curving, but the threat was clear. I walked out into the cold night, the echo of her words mingling with the image of Ethan lifting his glass, declaring himself the true heir. The night had been theirs, but something inside me whispered that it would not remain that way forever. The night of the assault came during another gathering at the estate, a celebration Martha insisted was meant to honor family legacy, but in truth was nothing more than another stage for Ethan to parade himself as rightful heir. The house was crowded with relatives, business associates, neighbors, and even a few local officials, all of them sipping champagne beneath the chandeliers while pretending not to notice the tension that ran like a current beneath the polished surface. I arrived late, not because I wanted to, but because the invitation had been timed that way, a small manipulation that ensured I entered when everyone was already seated. Whispers followed me as I crossed the marble floor toward the long dining table. Ethan was at the center again, his posture relaxed, his voice booming as he recounted some fabricated story about negotiating contracts. Martha laughed loudly at every punchline, her eyes flicking toward me with thinly veiled contempt. I slipped into my assigned seat once again, positioned near the swinging kitchen doors where servers brushed past me carrying trays of food. The humiliation was deliberate, but I focused on breathing steadily, reminding myself that every insult was evidence, every slight a mark against them. Dinner dragged on until finally Ethan raised his glass. He stood towering over the table and declared that he alone would carry the Whitman name forward, that he alone deserved the estate and the respect that came with it. Some guests applauded, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke against him. I remained still, my hands folded in my lap, my expression calm. Then his eyes found me. His smile curled into something darker. "You do not belong here, Clara," he said loudly enough for the entire room to hear. Before I could respond, he stepped around the table, his movements fast, purposeful. I tried to stand, but his hand slammed against my shoulder, shoving me backward. Gasps erupted, but no one rose to stop him. His foot came next, a brutal kick to my side that sent fire shooting through my chest. The crack was loud, unmistakable, the sound of bone giving way. I collapsed onto the marble floor, the breath knocked out of me, the taste of blood sharp in my mouth. I heard voices shouting, someone screaming for him to stop, but Martha's calm tone cut through the chaos. "She is exaggerating. She always does." Her words froze the room more effectively than the violence itself. I lay curled on the floor, each breath stabbing my ribs, the world spinning above me. Ethan stood over me, his chest heaving, sweat glistening on his forehead. "The inheritance is mine," he shouted, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. The chandelier rattled from the force of his roar. Phones appeared in hands, some guests recording, others pretending not to see. My vision blurred, but I caught sight of Aunt Lydia across the room, her face pale, her hands gripping the back of a chair. She did not move, but her eyes locked onto mine. Steady, silent, promising that she saw, that she remembered. Pain radiated through my chest as paramedics were finally called. The crowd parted reluctantly when the men in uniforms arrived, carrying equipment, their voices brisk and efficient. They lifted me gently onto a stretcher, the movement sending shocks of agony through my broken ribs. My fingers clutched the edge of the gurney, my nails digging into the fabric as I tried not to cry out. As they rolled me toward the door, I glanced back one last time. Ethan stood with his arms crossed, triumphant, while Martha rested a hand on his shoulder, her expression composed, detached. Not once did she look at me with concern. The last image I carried as the doors closed was her cold eyes watching me like an inconvenience finally being removed. The ambulance ride blurred into a haze of sirens and flashing lights. I fought to stay conscious, to hold on to the clarity that had sparked in me, even as pain consumed my body. At the hospital, bright lights flooded my vision as doctors and nurses swarmed around me. Questions came fast. "Where does it hurt? Can you breathe? What happened?" Each time I tried to answer, my voice cracked, my chest seared. They cut away the fabric of my dress, exposing the bruises already spreading dark across my skin. Dr. Patel introduced himself calmly, his voice steady, his eyes kind. "We will take x-rays, Clara," he said. "We need to see the damage." Minutes later, the images confirmed what I already knew. At least 2 ribs fractured, another possibly cracked. He explained the treatment, the time it would take to heal, the importance of rest. But what stayed with me most was the way he looked at me, not with pity, but with certainty. "This was not an accident," he said quietly when the nurse stepped away. "Someone did this to you, and you must not let them tell you otherwise." His words settled deep, stronger than any painkiller. The medical report became proof, undeniable and clear. While Martha tried to spin lies and Ethan tried to intimidate, I now had evidence. As I lay in the hospital bed that night, every breath shallow and painful, I realized the assault had broken more than ribs. It had broken the illusion they had built for so long, the facade of family unity, the story that I was weak and unworthy. The pain was real, but so was the clarity. They wanted me erased. Instead, they had given me the first weapon I needed, truth documented in ink and bone. The morning after the assault, the hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beep of the heart monitor and the faint hum of machines in the hallway. My ribs throbbed with each breath, a reminder of Ethan's rage and Martha's cold indifference, but beneath the pain there was a sharper ache, the kind that comes from knowing your own family wants you erased. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over, the echo of his voice screaming, "The inheritance is mine," still ringing in my ears. I was drifting in and out of sleep when a soft knock came at the door. I expected another nurse, but when I turned my head, I saw Aunt Lydia step inside. She carried no flowers, no food, only a small envelope clutched tightly in her hand. Her eyes scanned my bruised face and the bandages wrapping my chest. And for a moment, she simply stood there, her lips pressed together as if fighting back her own anger. Finally, she pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down, her voice low and steady. Clara, I need you to listen to me. I nodded, though even that small movement sent pain through my side. She placed the envelope gently on the blanket near my hand. Your father did not leave everything to Ethan. He would never have done that. My heart lurched confusion mixing with disbelief. I whispered, but I saw the will. Martha read it. Lydia shook her head, her eyes flashing. That paper is a forgery. Your father gave me a copy of the real will before he died. He told me he did not trust Martha to keep it safe. Slowly, with deliberate care, she opened the envelope and slid out several pages, the paper slightly yellowed, the signature at the bottom firm and clear. My eyes blurred with tears as I read the words. The estate was to be divided evenly, 50% to Ethan, 50% to me. My father's handwriting left no doubt. It was the same loops and slants I had seen on birthday cards on the notes he left in his study. He had remembered me. He had been fair until the end. Emotion surged up, raw and overwhelming. For months, I had believed the lie, believed that he had chosen to erase me in death the way my mother tried to erase me in life. But now, the truth was here, tangible, undeniable. Lydia reached across the bed, her hand covering mine. I did not show this earlier because I wanted the right moment. Last night, when I saw what they did to you, I knew the moment had come. She leaned closer, her voice fierce. You cannot let them win, Clara. You have proof now. You have more strength than you know. I closed my eyes, letting the words sink into the deepest parts of me. For the first time since my father's death, a spark of hope lit inside me. I thought of Martha's smirk, of Ethan's roar, of the laughter that had filled the dining room when they called me a leech. And now I thought of the truth resting in my lap, the will that restored my place, my dignity, my inheritance. Pain still racked my body, but it no longer felt like defeat. It felt like fuel. Lydia squeezed my hand once more before slipping the papers back into the envelope. Guard this with your life, she said. It is your shield and your weapon. She stood then, her presence commanding even in silence. As she reached the door, she turned back, her eyes softening. Your father would be proud of you. With that, she was gone, leaving me clutching the envelope as though it were oxygen. Hours passed, nurses came and went, Dr. Patel checked my ribs and assured me they would heal with time, but all I could think about was the envelope hidden under my pillow. For the first time, I was no longer reacting to their cruelty. I was preparing to fight. When the night fell and the hospital grew quiet, I whispered to myself the words that had become my mantra. Dignity is not negotiable. They had tried to break me, but instead they had handed me the proof I needed to break them. The days following Aunt Lydia's visit passed in a haze of pain. Determination and planning, each moment sharper than the last, because for the first time I was not only surviving but preparing to strike back. My ribs ached with every breath, the bruises on my side darkened into purples and blues that screamed of Ethan's violence. But alongside the injuries, there was a steady pulse of resolve that carried me forward. Dr. Patel had been thorough, documenting every fracture with precision, his medical report spelling out in black and white the truth of the assault. He stopped by my room each morning, his calm eyes reminding me that medicine could treat the body, but justice required more. You have proof, Clara, he said one morning as he checked the swelling along my side. Do not let them silence you this time. His words echoed Aunt Lydia's, and together they built a fortress inside me. When Detective Morrison arrived 2 days later, his presence filled the room with authority. He was broad-shouldered, middle-aged, his notepad already open before he sat down. Tell me everything, he said simply, and I did. I told him about the gathering, about Ethan's voice rising above the crowd, about the shove and the kicks, about Martha's chilling dismissal that I was exaggerating. He asked for names of witnesses, and I gave them, though I warned him many would side with my mother out of fear or loyalty. That is why we rely on evidence, he said, his pen scratching steadily across the page. He collected copies of Dr. Patel's medical records, promising to add them to the official assault report. Then I handed him something else, a small USB drive that a cousin had quietly slipped to me at the hospital. On it was a shaky but clear recording from the dinner, Ethan's voice booming, "The inheritance is mine," followed by the sight of him lunging toward me. Detective Morrison watched the clip on his tablet, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing. "This will help," he said quietly. But it was not enough for me to defend myself from the assault alone. I wanted the full truth exposed, the lies about the will torn apart, the fraud shattered in front of everyone who had ever clapped for Ethan's toasts. That was where Aunt Lydia's envelope came in. At night, when the hospital wing was quiet, I spread the papers across my lap, reading my father's words again and again until I could recite them from memory. 50% to Ethan, 50% to Clara. The balance he had always believed in, the fairness he had upheld even when he was stern. I made copies, locking one set in the hospital safe, another with Lydia, and a third tucked inside a folder that I carried with me at all times once I was discharged. Martha and Ethan did not sit idly by during those days. They called, left messages, even sent a lawyer to the hospital suggesting that I sign a statement withdrawing my complaint. The lawyer smiled smoothly, spoke of family unity, of avoiding scandal, but his words were poison. "Withdraw your claim," he urged. "It is better for everyone." I looked him in the eye and said evenly, "Better for them, maybe, but not for me." He left with tight lips, and I knew then that they were nervous. My mother herself visited once, standing at the foot of my hospital bed with a bouquet of lilies that reeked of hypocrisy. She set them on the table, her smile polished, her eyes cold. "Let this go, Clara," she said softly. "Do not embarrass the family further. Think of your father's reputation." The audacity nearly stole my breath. I glanced at the flowers, then back at her. If you cared about his reputation, you would not have forged his will. For the first time, her smile faltered, just for a flicker, before she composed herself and walked out. That small crack fueled me. Preparing the case became my lifeline. I met with Lydia often, her calm presence grounding me. She told me stories of my father, of conversations where he expressed doubt about Martha's intentions, of the day he handed her the duplicate will and asked her to keep it safe. "He trusted me because he knew she would lie," Lydia said firmly. "Now it is time to honor that trust." Together, we organized the documents, medical reports from Dr. Patel, the video footage of Ethan's assault, the authentic will, signed and witnessed, and even bank records that hinted at Martha's financial manipulations in the months after my father's death. Each piece was a stone in the foundation I was building, not just to defend myself, but to expose the rot at the core of the Whitman family. By the time Detective Morrison returned with updates, I was ready. He confirmed that charges were being prepared against Ethan for assault and battery, that Martha's forged will would be investigated as fraud once the authentic copy was submitted. The case would go to court, and it would not be quiet. Martha and Ethan wanted silence. They wanted shadows where lies could thrive, but I was bringing everything into the light. The thought of standing in a courtroom, ribs still aching, eyes on me from every direction, was terrifying, but it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, I would not be the quiet daughter in the corner. I would be the voice that ended their performance. On the night before my release from the hospital, I stood by the window overlooking the city lights. The envelope with the will rested against my chest, my ribs wrapped tight beneath bandages, each breath still a struggle. But in that struggle there was strength. They had broken my bones, but in doing so they had given me the clarity I needed. Tomorrow I would walk out, not just as Clara the liability, but as Clara the witness, the fighter, the rightful heir. And I promised myself then that when the courtroom doors opened, I would carry not just my pain, but every piece of evidence that proved I was never as weak as they wanted me to believe. The morning of the trial arrived with a gray sky hanging over the courthouse, the kind of heavy clouds that seemed to press down on the city itself. But inside me, there was a clarity sharper than the ache in my ribs. I walked through the tall double doors with Aunt Lydia at my side. The authentic will tucked safely into the folder I carried, my steps slow but deliberate, each one echoing across the marble floor. The courtroom was already packed when we entered, every bench filled with relatives, neighbors, business associates, and even reporters who had caught wind of the scandal unraveling inside the Whitman family. At the front table sat Martha and Ethan with their attorney, a sharp-faced man in a tailored suit who looked at me like I was already defeated. Ethan leaned back in his chair, smug, his jaw clenched as if daring me to meet his eyes. Martha sat poised, her pearls gleaming against her collarbone, her face calm but her fingers twisting a pen nervously. When the judge entered the room, the crowd rose, then settled into silence. The proceedings began with the charges against Ethan for assault. Their lawyer argued quickly, claiming that I had tripped, that the injury was exaggerated, that family disputes often escalated in ways outsiders misunderstood. He painted Ethan as protective, concerned, misinterpreted. But when Dr. Patel was called to the stand, his calm professional voice sliced through the web of excuses. He described the X-rays in detail, the fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, the medical certainty that my injuries were not accidental. He held up the images for the jury, the bones of my ribs broken in black and white, undeniable. I watched Martha's face tighten, Ethan's smug smile flicker, the lawyer scramble to redirect. Then came the video. Detective Morrison stepped forward with a steady presence, explaining how the footage had been collected from a guest's phone. The screen flickered to life in front of the courtroom, showing Ethan rising from his seat, shouting, "The inheritance is mine," and then lunging toward me. The sound of the crack echoed in the recording, followed by the chaos of voices. Gasps filled the courtroom, heads turned sharply toward Ethan. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his knuckles white against the table. Their lawyer objected, tried to claim the video was taken out of context, but the judge overruled him. The evidence was too clear. Then Aunt Lydia took the stand, her presence calm but firm. She recounted my father's words the day he entrusted her with the duplicate will, his doubts about Martha's intentions, his insistence that fairness be preserved. With deliberate care, she held up the authentic document, the ink still bold, the signature unmistakably Douglas Whitman's. The clerk read it aloud, each line restoring what Martha had tried to erase, half of the estate to Ethan, half to me. The courtroom seemed to breathe collectively, as if a hidden truth had finally broken through the lies. Reporters scribbled notes, furiously flashes from cameras flickered in the back. Martha's face went pale, her composure cracking for the first time, her lips pressed so tightly they nearly disappeared. Ethan muttered under his breath, his fists clenching, his body restless like a caged animal. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, pain flaring in my ribs, but dignity holding me upright. I told the jury what had happened, not just that night, but throughout my life, the years of being diminished, the whispered word, liability, the erasure from family photos, the humiliation at dinners, the forged will, the assault that nearly crushed me. I spoke steadily, my voice clear, refusing to let it break. Silence followed when I finished, the weight of truth settling over the room like a stone. The defense tried to fight back, painting me as bitter, as jealous, as unstable, but each argument collapsed under the evidence, medical reports, video footage, the authentic will. The judge's gavel struck sharply when closing arguments ended, and the jury retreated to deliberate. The wait was short, less than 2 hours, but it felt like an eternity. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. Ethan Whitman was guilty of assault and battery, sentenced to probation, fines, and restitution for medical expenses. Martha Whitman was referred for investigation on charges of fraud and forgery regarding the will her reputation effectively shattered, even before the legal process concluded. The estate was ordered to be divided, as Douglas had intended, restoring my rightful share. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some in shock, others in vindicated whispers. I stood there breathing slowly, the pain in my ribs sharp but dulled by the swell of triumph coursing through me. Ethan's face was red veins bulging at his temple, his body straining against the deputies who now kept him seated. Martha slumped back in her chair, her eyes hollow, her pearls suddenly looking cheap against the ruin of her image. Aunt Lydia touched my shoulder gently, her quiet smile saying more than words ever could. For the first time in years, I felt seen not as a liability, not as the weak one, but as the woman who had endured and fought and finally been heard. When the gavel fell one final time, closing the session, the sound echoed through me like release. The days that followed the verdict unfolded like a storm breaking after years of heavy clouds, the air charged with aftermath and revelation. News of the trial spread quickly, newspapers running headlines like "Golden Child Exposed" and "Whitman Estate Scandal Rocks Community." Photos of Ethan in court, red-faced and furious, were splashed across front pages, while Martha's once pristine image as a charitable society woman was dissected on talk shows, her reputation crumbling under the weight of fraud allegations. Business partners who had once courted her influence withdrew, silently canceling meetings and rescinding invitations to galas. Her name, once spoken with admiration in polished circles, became a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. Ethan, though spared a lengthy prison term, found himself shackled in other ways. The probation required weekly check-ins, the fines and restitution bled into his accounts, and the community he once strutted through like a king now regarded him with thinly veiled contempt. Former friends avoided him at the gym, neighbors crossed the street to steer clear of his glare, and whispers followed him in every public space. He had shouted the inheritance is mine in front of witnesses, and now those same witnesses laughed quietly at his downfall. Martha tried to control the narrative, giving a single interview where she claimed misunderstandings and exaggerated stories had ruined her family. But the interviewer pressed harder, citing the authentic will, the medical records, the video footage. She faltered, her carefully rehearsed lines dissolving into stammers, the clip replayed endlessly online until her credibility was beyond repair. In contrast, I found myself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Strangers stopped me in the grocery store, some offering sympathy, others admiration for standing up against the two people who had sought to erase me. It was uncomfortable at first, the attention prickling my skin, but I learned to accept that their words were not about spectacle, but about recognition. They saw me, they saw the truth, and that was something I had been denied for most of my life. My apartment filled with letters, some from survivors of family abuse who told me my fight gave them courage, others from neighbors who had always suspected something was wrong in the Whitman household but had never dared to speak. Aunt Lydia remained my anchor, guiding me through the chaos with her quiet strength. She managed logistics, handled reporters, reminded me to eat when exhaustion threatened to pull me under. She told me often that my father's trust in her had not been misplaced, that this was the justice he would have wanted. Yet even in victory, the wounds lingered. My ribs ached every morning when I woke, the scars on my skin, constant reminders of Ethan's rage. Nightmares plagued me, flashes of his face looming over me, Martha's cold voice insisting I was exaggerating. Therapy sessions became part of my routine, a place where I began to untangle years of gaslighting, years of being told I was nothing. Slowly, I learned to believe what the evidence had already proven: I was not weak. I was never weak. As for Martha, the investigation deepened. Financial records revealed questionable transfers, unexplained withdrawals, and a pattern of deceit that stretched back years. Prosecutors prepared charges that could strip her of influence permanently. The society that once adored her turned cold. Her invitations vanished, her phone calls unanswered. I heard through cousins that she spent her days in the mansion, pacing the halls, the pearls still around her neck, but no audience left to admire them. Ethan drifted aimlessly angry and bitter, stripped of privilege without understanding accountability. He raged in bars, muttered about betrayal, but even his allies had abandoned him. He was a man marked not only by law, but by shame. And then there was me. I received my rightful share of the estate, enough to secure independence, but it was never about the money. It was about the validation that my father's intentions had been honored, that the lies had been stripped bare. I invested carefully, not in extravagance, but in stability, building the life they told me I could never sustain. When I walked through the city now, head high, shoulders back, I no longer carried the weight of invisibility. The fallout was not just theirs, it was mine too, but mine was the kind that cleared the air, that allowed space for growth. The Whitman family name would forever be tarnished by scandal, but for me, it was no longer a shackle. It was a past I had survived, a story I had reclaimed. And as much as their downfall satisfied the part of me that craved justice, the true consequence was freedom. They had lost control over me, over the narrative, over the inheritance they tried to steal. I had endured their cruelty, I had faced their violence, and I had emerged not erased, but undeniable. In the weeks after the courtroom battle and the storm of media attention, I began to rebuild my life piece by piece, slowly stitching together the fragments of myself that years of humiliation and months of violence had torn apart. My new apartment was small, a modest 2-bedroom overlooking the river, but to me it felt like a palace, because it was mine alone, untouched by Martha's cold gaze or Ethan's toxic presence. I furnished it simply with second-hand pieces, a sturdy oak desk where I spread my blueprints, a soft couch where I could collapse after long days, and shelves that soon filled with books and plants. The silence there was not heavy like the silence of the Whitman mansion, but gentle, restorative. The kind of quiet that lets wounds breathe. My ribs still ached, especially in the mornings when I stretched, but the physical pain became part of a ritual of resilience. I traced the faint scars with my fingertips and reminded myself that I had survived, that the cracks had not broken me, but had revealed the strength I carried. I began consulting for an engineering firm, taking projects that aligned with the work I loved, designing bridges and community spaces, structures meant to last. Each paycheck felt like more than money. It felt like proof that I could stand on my own, that my worth had never been tied to inheritance or approval. Therapy became a weekly anchor, a space where I learned to unravel the lies that had been planted in me since childhood. My therapist listened as I recounted Martha's words, Ethan's jeers, the label liability that had hung over me like a curse. She helped me see how false those words were, how carefully they had been constructed to control me. Week by week, I replaced them with truths. I was capable, I was resilient, I was worthy of love and belonging. Slowly, the nightmares began to fade. The vision of Ethan towering over me, the crack of my ribs breaking the sneer on Martha's face when she called me weak, they still came but less often, and when they did, I breathed through them, grounding myself in the reality that I was safe, that their power was gone. Aunt Lydia visited often, bringing meals and gentle conversation. She never pried, never pressed, simply sat with me, reminding me that family could mean loyalty and kindness, not cruelty and betrayal. One evening, we walked along the river, the water reflecting the sunset in fractured gold. Lydia slipped her arm through mine and whispered, "Your father would be proud of you." The words filled my chest with warmth, a balm against the lingering ache of his absence. For years, I had doubted his love, doubted that I mattered to him, but the authentic will, his insistence on fairness, had been his final message to me, and I clung to it like a lifeline. As news of Martha's fraud investigation deepened, I chose not to follow every headline. It was enough to know that truth had caught up with her, that her empire of manipulation was crumbling. Ethan's probation kept him tethered, but his own anger was punishment enough, and I no longer wasted energy on his bitterness. Their downfall no longer consumed me because my healing required turning away, choosing not to let their shadows stretch into my future. I joined a local support group for survivors of family abuse, walking into a church basement one Thursday evening with my heart pounding, unsure if I belonged. But when I heard others speak, women and men who had been silenced, belittled, hurt by the people meant to love them, I felt something shift. For the first time, I was not alone in my story. I shared my own piece by piece, and each time I did, the shame lost its grip, replaced by solidarity and strength. They broke my ribs, I told the group one night, my voice trembling, but they did not break my will. The room fell silent, then heads nodded, eyes shone with recognition. In their acceptance, I found a new layer of healing. Freedom was not just about escaping the mansion, not just about winning in court. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself that had been silenced. I began painting again, a hobby I had abandoned in childhood when Martha dismissed it as childish. I filled canvases with colors that spilled out of me like emotions I had kept hidden, deep blues of sorrow, fiery reds of rage, bright yellows of hope. Hanging them on my own walls felt like declaring independence in brushstrokes. On weekends, I walked by the river, letting the wind tangle my hair, the rhythm of the water calming the lingering storms inside me. Sometimes I pressed my hand gently to my ribs, not in pain, but in remembrance, a reminder of both fragility and endurance. The scars were permanent, but so was the strength they marked. Closure did not come in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of small choices, choosing to answer the phone when a friend called instead of withdrawing, choosing to smile back at a stranger in the grocery line, choosing to forgive myself for the years I believed the lies. Martha and Ethan may have written me out of their story, but I had written myself into my own. And in that story, I was not a liability, not a victim, but a survivor standing on her own 2 feet, building a life that was finally mine. A year after the trial, I stood once again before the gates of the Whitman estate, the sprawling mansion looming behind them, its windows dark, the gardens unkempt, the silence almost eerie. For most of my life, that house had symbolized power control and humiliation, but now it stood as nothing more than a monument to the collapse of lies. Martha had retreated into isolation after the fraud charges stripped her of influence, the society that once adored her shutting her out completely. Ethan lived elsewhere under the shadow of probation, his anger consuming him, his once easy charm burned away by shame. Standing there, I realized I no longer feared this place, nor did I crave entry. I had my share of the estate, my independence, my peace, and I did not need those walls to validate me. I turned away from the gates and walked toward the life I had built. My apartment had become a home filled with light and laughter, with projects I chose, with friendships nurtured with quiet evenings painting or walking along the river. Work had flourished too. I had earned respect not through inheritance but through skill consulting on designs that carried my name alone. Each success tasted sweeter because it was mine, not granted as a reluctant favor, not overshadowed by Ethan's shadow. Yet what mattered most was not the money or the recognition, but the healing. Therapy continued to peel back layers of hurt, the support group gave me community, and slowly I forgave myself for years of silence. I realized survival itself had been an act of resistance, that every time I endured their cruelty without losing myself, I had been stronger than they ever imagined. Aunt Lydia remained by my side, her faith in me unwavering. One evening, we sat on my balcony watching the sunset bleed into the water, and she told me, "Clara, justice is not always about the courtroom. Sometimes justice is simply the life you live after." Her words settled into me like truth carved in stone. Justice had come in the form of verdicts and headlines, but it had also come in the quiet of mornings when I woke without dread, in the rhythm of painting strokes across canvas, in the laughter shared with people who valued me. The moral of my story was not only that cruelty can be exposed, that lies can be shattered, but that endurance can become strength, and strength can become freedom. For those who watched me collapse on marble floors, for those who believed Martha's words that I was exaggerating the courtroom had been proof. But for me, the true proof was in living and refusing to let their violence define me and choosing to build instead of destroy. Sometimes I walk along the pier where my father once took me as a child, the water lapping gently against the wood, the sky open and vast. I press my hand against the place where my ribs once cracked and whisper to myself they tried to break me, but they only forged me. And I know then that closure is not the absence of scars, but the choice to carry them as reminders, not chains. To anyone who has ever been erased by their own family, who has been silenced or called weak, my story is a promise you are stronger than their lies. Do not let them convince you otherwise. The inheritance I fought for was not just money. It was the right to exist, to be seen, to have my truth honored. And now, when I look at the reflection of the skyline on the river, I see not the shadows of the Whitman mansion, but the glow of a life rebuilt. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet sound of closing a door behind you and never needing to look back.